Arabic Egypt is underrated and too unappreciated for its vast history and greatness. All the focus on Egyptian history is usually on Egypt before it was conquered by the Romans and then later integrated into the Roman Empire. Usually there is a focus upon, for example, the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt with Queen Cleopatra, and classical Egypt with kings such as Ramses II and Tutankhamun. But rarely do we in the West talk about Egypt after the Arabic Islamic invasion under Amr bin al-As in 640. It is so rare that we speak about this, in fact, that I remember when I was studying Egyptian history and I was asked by a person from Egypt, in Arabic I might add, "What are you studying now?" Egyptian history, as I have not focused upon it before. You are going to find that those Egyptians of the past had a really strange religion. To which I replied, I study Ayyubid history, the Ayyubids or the Ayyubiyun, being one of the Islamic dynasties of Egypt, the dynasty created by Salahuddin, or as he is better known in the West, Saladin, and the Sunni Islamic dynasty, Sunni Islam being the majority religion for most modern Egyptians, including this guy, creating an awkward situation. This guy couldn't fathom that I was actually studying Arabic history, despite the fact that he knew that I was able to speak Arabic, because he thought I would have focused upon ancient Egyptian history rather than on Arabic Egyptian history. But Arabic Egyptian history is filled with very interesting events following the conquest of Egypt by the Arabic Islamic invasions and its various events, which are an interesting history in itself. You have the Umayyad control of Egypt from 661 to 750, which ends with the Abbasid revolution, where the Caliph Marwan II, the 14th Caliph of the Umayyads, flees to Egypt, but ends up being killed in Egypt by people that are sympathetic to the Abbasid revolution. So the end of the Umayyads in the Eastern Arabic world, one of the greatest caliphal dynasties in Islamic history, occurred in Egypt. Following the killing of Marwan II, Egypt is taken over by the Abbasids. And then you also have an interesting series of events in Egypt during the chaos in Samarra from 861 to 870, where Egypt is thrown into a series of conflicts and civil wars and rebellions against the Abbasids, and from this sprang the Tuluniyun dynasty from 868 to 905. The Tuluniyun dynasty was a Mamluk dynasty, that is to say a dynasty made up of slave soldiers that had served the Abbasids before under the leadership of Ahmed ibn Tulun. This was the first slave soldier rebellion that succeeded in creating their own political entity, though the Abbasids would eventually defeat the Tulunids again, but the Abbasids would be thrown out of Egypt again by the Ikhshid dynasty. And the Ikhshid dynasty of 933 and 969 was another rebellion caused in large part by slave soldiers. So you will get a reoccurring history of slave soldier rebellions throughout Egyptian history. But eventually the Ikhshids are conquered by the Fatimids, an Ismaili Shia dynasty that represents the first really large Shia political entity that is stable for a longer time. And the Fatimids conquered Egypt in 969, and the Fatimids were also responsible for the establishment of Cairo. And under Al-Mu'izz, one of the Fatimid caliphs, Cairo would become the capital of the Fatimid Caliphate, and thus Egypt would be the center of the largest political entity in northern Africa and in the Middle East. And the Fatimid period of Egypt, from 969 to 1171, can be seen as the golden age of Ismaili thought and literature, as Egypt was slowly converted into Ismaili Shiaism, which is a subsect of Shia Islam, and Egypt was getting richer due to all the wealth flowing into it from all around the Middle East, as the borders of the Fatimids were almost constantly expanding during its earlier history. And thus the Fatimid period for Egypt represents an age of power, and Egypt being a center of power far beyond any pre-Arabic Egyptian dynasty. No other Egyptian dynasty in Egyptian history had ever had these sorts of vast borders, this greatness of power as the Fatimids. Granted, the Fatimids came from the outside, as they came from western northern Africa and conquered eastward until they conquered Egypt. But so did the 25th dynasty and the Hyksos dynasty of the past too, but we consider those dynasties Egyptian in pre-Islamic times, despite not being native dynasties. The Fatimids also have a lot of interesting characters, such as Al-Hakim bi-Amri Allah, a caliph that is sometimes called the Mad Caliph, and I've actually made a video about him where I argue that he was probably not that mad. Link is in the description. Though eventually the Fatimids would lose power, as there would be a coup against the Fatimids in 1171 by none other than Salahuddin, or Saladin as you know him, as he would take complete control after having gradually taking over more and more power within the Fatimid Caliphate. And under Salahuddin, the first Ayyubid Sultan, Egypt would be reconverted to Sunni Islam from Ismaili Shia Islam through a rather brutal suppression of Shiism, and Saladin would further expand the borders of the Ayyubid dynasty and again make a greater empire than any dynasty in the past except for the Fatimids. And here you could say that Salahuddin was not a native Egyptian either, since he was a Kurd that came from the outside. But again, remember the 25th dynasty and the Hyksos before. This isn't a new thing for Egyptian history. This is something that has happened a lot even in pre-Islamic, pre-Arabic Egyptian history. But anyway, one thing to also notice about the Ayyubids are that they are technically, they and the later Mamluks that take over after them, an Abbasid sub-sultanate, in that they say that they are ruling as proxies for the Abbasids in order to get the caliphal legitimacy of the Abbasids. But in facto, they are the direct rulers of the area, and the Abbasids were more or less just there to give them legitimacy. Also, the Ayyubids also claim to be a Roman dynasty, and also claim that of being a kind of new Rome, as they couldn't claim to be caliphs, as that title belonged to the Abbasids. So, they claimed to be Romans instead. And this is, for example, why you see the eagle on the Saladin banner being so similar to Roman eagles. In other words, the Ayyubids did what the later Seljuk Sultanate of Rome, as well as the Ottoman Empire, would do in claiming Roman heritage and affiliation in order to grant themselves legitimacy. But eventually the Ayyubids would lose power, as the Mamluks, that is to say once again the slave soldiers, would gradually take over power in the 13th century and announce a Mamluk Sultanate eventually. During the later Ayyubids and early Mamluks, you're starting also to see the processes that would make Sudan become as it is today, that is to say an Arab country. The Mamluks would begin to conquer southward, and you would also get a lot of Arab influences through these conquests and Mamluk presence into the region of Sudan, together with later movements of Arabic groups would transform Sudan into an Arab country. During the Mamluk time, you also have the fact that the Abbasids had to flee into the Mamluk lands from Baghdad after the Mongols had conquered the area. And though the Abbasids were still nominally in control of Egypt, in fact it was the Mamluks themselves that were controlling Egypt. Though, just like the previous Ayyubid dynasty, the Mamluks claimed that they were a sultanate under the authority of the Abbasids due to the legitimacy it brought. So technically the Abbasids controlled Egypt during both the Ayyubid dynasty and the Mamluks. And this sort of figurehead rulership would last until the war with the Ottomans, where the Ottomans invaded the Mamluk Sultanate and took it over and disposed of the Abbasids and now took the claim of being the caliphs for themselves. And the Ottomans also tried to impose a lot of religious changes in Egypt, trying to impose their type of Maturidi Hanafi Islam upon the Egyptians, which resulted in a lot of conflicts with local Shafi'i Ash'ari imams rejecting it, and thus there is a lot of turbulent history with the Ottoman conquest and control of Egypt due to factionalism between Sunni Islamic groups, and you have still a lot of local Mamluk families having control and being players for power against the Ottomans that are on paper the rulers of Egypt. Then you have the invasion of Egypt under Napoleon, followed by a lot of turbulence, and then later the dynasty of Muhammad Ali, and then you have the British takeover of Egypt, and then you have in the 20th century the independence of Egypt and the modern history of Egypt, with, for example, Gamal Abdel Nasser and the modern history of Egypt, where Egypt becomes a center for pan-Arab nationalism, and you also have Egypt being a center for modern Islamism, with, for example, Hassan al-Banna, one of the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood and modern political Islamic movements. Arabic Egyptian history is not only just dates and dynasties in the abstract. Egyptian Arabic history also includes a lot of architecture and buildings. Sure, these are no pyramids or the Great Sphinx of Giza, but they are still functioning buildings, which are quite impressive in their own right. And I would even say even more impressive in certain regards than the older architecture of the Egyptians. For example, you have Khan el-Khalili, a great market square that dates back to the Fatimid period, but did get its modern form during the Mamluk period. You also have the Masjid ibn Tulun, which goes back to the Tulunid dynasty and is one of the oldest mosques in existence that is still functioning. You have the Masjid al-Hakim, which is the mosque of Al-Hakim bi Amrillah, which is a mosque that goes back to the period of the Fatimid ruler Al-Hakim bi Amrillah, the Mad Caliph, who built this fantastic great mosque. And on the subject of the Fatimids and the mosques, you have Jami Al-Azhar, which is a mosque and a university that was first founded by the Fatimids and that functioned as a center of learning and culture in the Middle East. And Cairo, when it was at its peak in power as the capital of the Fatimids, it and Egypt generally would be known as al-Umam, Mother of the Nations. And the Fatimids' patronage of science and learning would make Cairo and the greater Egypt known as Dar al-Ilm, the house of knowledge. And this reputation is quite comparable to the reputation of the Library of Alexandria of ancient Egypt. So Cairo was in the past, through Al-Azhar, one of the centers of learning. And you have to remember also that during the Middle Ages, the Middle East was the greatest place of culture and learning generally, and Egypt was the center of this. And what was developed in Egypt in terms of knowledge did influence Western developments. You have, for example, astronomers like Ali bin Yunus, and physicians like Tamimi and Ibn Ridwan, mathematicians and engineers like Ibn Haytham, who was known in Europe by the Latin name Al-Hasan. Ibn Haytham's greatest contribution was in the field of optics, for which he has been named by certain people as the father of optics, and he laid the foundation for later advances in the study of lights and optics, which are based upon his observations and findings. And this was during the Fatimid period. Al-Azhar as a university was a center of learning in a greater context of greater learning in Egypt. And after the Fatimids had lost their power and gotten replaced by the Ayyubids, Al-Azhar still continued to be an important place of learning. And Al-Azhar to this day, but now for Sunni Islam, as the Ayyubids changed the state religion from Shia Ismaili Islam into Sunni Islam, has been a center of Islamic theology within Sunni Islam, and could probably be considered the #1 place of Islamic learning within Sunni Islam. And all of these things I've mentioned, and all of this history that I've briefly gone over, is just a small drop of the enormous ocean of greatness and richness of history that exists regarding Arabic Egypt, and that definitely makes Arabic Egypt the equal of ancient Egypt in terms of historical importance. Yet we rarely talk about this, and I hope I have gotten your interests with this video, because I plan to make a lot more videos about Egyptian Arabic history in the future.
Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.